Welcome to my meta review for the best decks in Standard, ranging from budget decks that caught my attention to best of 3 and then best of 1. So this week we're going to start things off with the Rainbow Humans by Pier Francesco, 1987. And this is a list that I saw that a Mythic just recently hit Mythic in best of 3. And so it's got a lot similar. It's got a lot of similarities to Mono White Humans. So we've got cards like Recruitment Officer, Adeline, Thalia, Anointed Peacekeeper, which we've seen in some lists kind of come and go in Mono White Humans, Brutal Cathar, and then we're splashing for other other powerful humans. So we've got Garena, Dauntless General, which splashing black for a 2/2 when it enters the battlefield, exile target player's graveyard, and you can sacrifice Garena to give your humans hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. So nice extra protection. We've got Catilda, Dawnheart Prime, which is a 1/1 for green and a white that gives your humans the ability to tap for 1 mana of this creature's colors, and then for 4, a green and a white, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. So it kind of helps you ramp out your hand, and then it gives you kind of a late game mana sink. And then we've got Helana and Elena, partners. 2/3 first strike reach that at the beginning of your combat put X +1/+1 counters on another target creature you control, where X is Helana and Elena's power, and then that creature gains haste until end of turn. So if they don't answer Helana and Elena, you can definitely run away with games. And then we've got because a lot of these humans are legendaries, we can bring in Plaza of Heroes to fix for the mana for the legendary spells, but also to protect them. So you can tap 3 colorless, tap it in exile to give target legendary creature hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. And what really allows us to get away with doing this many different colors over just, say, like mono white, is that Cavern of Souls is like Secluded Courtyard. For tribal decks, it's rainbow fixing. So both Secluded Courtyard and Cavern of Souls tap for 1 mana of any color, as long as you're spending it for the chosen creature type. So very interesting list, and excited to try it out. The sideboard, we've got Dauntless Dismantler, which was kind of fun to see because this is a new card that we got in Lost Caverns of Ixalan. This one's specifically just artifact hate, so if you're coming up against like the Azorius artifact deck, you can bring this in. We've got Dinnick, which is a 2/3 lifelinker, so it helps against like the mono red and the early aggressive strategies, but also prevents cards in graveyards from being targeted by spells or abilities. So if you do come up against like a Trespasser or something like that, then Dinnick prevents people from messing with the yard. We've got an Anointed Peacekeeper, 2 more copies of that. So you usually see like either 4 copies of Brutal Cathar or 2 copies of Peacekeeper and 2 copies of Brutal Cathar. And so I imagine you kind of sub out the Brutal Cathars for the Anointed Peacekeepers if you come into a matchup that doesn't have a lot of targets for the Brutal Cathar, right? Like when you're playing up against Azorius Control, for example, Brutal Cathar, often you just have to play it out as a 2/2 for 3. And so that's, I imagine, why the Anointed Peacekeeper is in the list. We got Extraction Specialist, which we've seen kind of come and go. It's got really nice interaction with the Coppercoat Vanguard and Thalia, just being able to bring them back and kind of bring back the ward or the disruption for your opponent's interaction. We've got Destroy Evil, which is really nice against the wedding announcements and Virtue of Loyalty that we see a lot of times in Esper Midrange. Get Lost for more targeted spot removal, like if the Brutal Cathars really aren't hacking it and every time that you play it they're just getting destroyed. Get Lost is a nice alternative, as long as the game isn't going too long where they start to get value out of the map tokens that are created. Second copy of Extraction Specialist, and then 2 copies of Graveyard Trespasser, which I thought was kind of an interesting one. There's not a whole lot of Reanimator strategies in the meta right now, so kind of interesting to see the Graveyard hate. But usually there's some card like Unlicensed Hearse or something like that that can attack Graveyard specific strategies. Second up on the list is an Esper Flash deck by R. De Prodi. And this was another one that I saw that hit Mythic in best of 3. And so this one's really leaning on Flash synergies. So we've got things like, we've got Skrelv to kind of protect our important guys once they're on the battlefield. We've got the disruption of like Deep Cavern Bat. So just this combination right here, you're removing their interaction and then you're protecting it so that they have to hit Skrelv before they hit the Deep Cavern Bat, and just really a nice disruptive combo. And then for the flash creatures or the flash payoffs, we've got Fairy Mastermind, which is a 2/1 flash for 2 that whenever your opponent draws a second card each turn, you draw a card as well, and then you can force each player to draw a card. And then we've got Werefox Bodyguard, which is kind of like Cathar, but you can use it to protect your own stuff, because you can sacrifice it for 1 and a white to get the thing that you exiled back. And then we've got Errant and Giada, which is a 2/3 flying flash for 1, a white, and a blue. And you can look at the top card of your library at any time, and if that top card is a creature with flying or flash, then you can cast it off the top of your library, so it gives you additional dig. And then we've got some, because we're going to have our mana up, because we're bringing things in with flash, we've got counter spells with like Make Disappear. And then further disruption, we've got like Wandering Emperor, which is really good removal, also creates late game threats, and it's just a general pain to play around. We've got like Cut Down, and one that was kind of one that you don't see very often is Plunge into Winter. So we've got this one is a 1 and a white, tap up to 1 target creature, scry 1, and then draw a card. So I thought this one was kind of an interesting one to see. Kind of a new one that you don't often see. But being able to just disrupt your opponent's blockers or something that's in the air while being card neutral. Curious to see how it plays out. And then it is a best of 3 list, so we've got Spell Pierce for against being able to play around Sunfall, etc. Another copy of Cut Down if we're up against an early aggressive strategy. Disenchant, which is another one that you don't typically see because you're running like the Destroy Evils, so that you can hit other things. But just mainboarding the sideboarding the Disenchant. Disdainful Stroke, Make Disappear, Negate, kind of to tweak that counterspell package against what your opponent is playing. 1 copy of Go for the Throat. If you're playing against somebody who doesn't have a lot of artifact creatures and has a specific thing that like Shieldred that you need to deal with, then you can bring in the Go for the Throat. 4 copies of Duress to play against Azorius Control and really hate on their hand. Change the Equation, which counter target spell with mana value 2 or less, or counter target red or green spell with mana value 6 or less. So you can bring this in specifically, I would imagine, against Domain or maybe against Gruul Dinos. Shieldred's Edict, just a 1 copy of, if you're playing against like Azorius Control, this allows you to target. It's really good for taking out planeswalkers. 1 copy of Unlicensed Hearse for a little bit of graveyard hate, and then 1 copy of Path of Peril for wiping your opponent's board. So it's now time for the best of 3 tournament winners, and we got Golgari Midrange by 420 Dragon took number 1 during the Standard Challenge 32 on December 30th. And if we compare this to how it's changed, 3 weeks ago I covered Golgari Midrange, and this list is dropping 1 copy of Nissa, Ascended Animist, and bringing in 1 copy of Sorin the Mirthless. So we still have a total of... we still have 2 Planeswalkers. Sorin over Nissa, I think, is taking advantage of the lifelink and flying that Sorin can create, whereas like this can be a little bit awkward in decks that are bringing in other colors because of it's better the more forests that you have in play. But so I thought that was an interesting addition. And then we've also got 1 additional copy of Go for the Throat for some more targeted spot removal, ditching the Shieldred's Edict and Gix's Command, and deciding to play 1 more land in the main, which was Argoth, Sanctum of Nature, which enters the battlefield tapped unless you control a legendary green creature. So like, works with your Glissa Sunslayer, and basically gives you a late game alternative to 2 double pip green. You can tap it to create a 2/2 bear creature token and then mill 3 cards. So this works really nicely for getting things into your graveyard, which works nicely with the Blossoming Tortoise. And there's kind of this self-mill strategy, which is partly why some lists were exploring like doing a Reanimator thing in Golgari. I'm really curious about this deck and where it ultimately will end up, because I do think that it has a lot of flexibility and can go many different ways depending on the matchups. So in the best of 3 sideboard, we've got an additional copy of Cut Down for the aggro decks, 3 copies of Duress for against the control matchup, Anoint with Affliction if you're up against the mirror match. This is particularly nice for getting rid of the Mosswood Dread Knights. Tranquil Frillback, which is really good against the Esper Midrange if they're running like Wedding Announcement or the Virtues. Being able to play a 3/3 that also destroys an artifact or enchantment is quite nice. And then you can also use this to gain 4 life, so sometimes you'll bring this in if you're up against an aggro strategy and need some more stabilization. The Gix's command that was in the main is now moved to the sideboard, so you can use this for a Wrath if you're up against something going wide, because it can destroy each creature with power 2 or less. You can also put two +1/+1 counters on something and give it lifelink, which works particularly nice with Glissa. And then you can also take advantage of that mill to return up to 2 creature cards from your graveyard to your hand, so you can use it for a little bit of a draw. And then each opponent sacrifices a creature with the highest power among creatures they control, so you can use this to remove a problematic threat. The versatility of this card matches the versatility of what Golgari is doing, so you're going to bring this in for different reasons against a lot of different decks. Breach the Multiverse is a really nice like alternative win condition. Terra Sunder is kind of like the destroy evil for Golgari. The ability to either play it as a disenchant to exile target artifact or enchantment if you're up against like Esper Midrange, or to kick it for 1 and a black for a total of 4 to exile target non-land permanent. Also gives you some exile spot removal for the mirror match against Dread Knight. We've got 2 copies of Path of Peril, which you could bring in against the board the board flood strategies along with Gix's command. Phyrexian Arena, which if you're not being pressured on your life total, allows you to kind of outvalue your other mid-range opponents and win through card advantage. And then last but not least, we've got Titania, Voice of Gaia, which is a 3/4 reach. Whenever 1 or more lands are put into your graveyard from anywhere, you gain 2 life. And this works really nicely with the Blossoming Tortoise and can gain you a ton of life. And at the beginning of your upkeep, if there are 4 or more cards, land cards in your graveyard, and you both own and control Titania, and then Argoth, Sanctum of Nature, which is the green land that has been added, you can use this to flip it into Titania Gaia Incarnate, which is a star Vigilance, Reach, Trample, Haste, and has power and toughness equal to the number of lands you control. And when it enters the battlefield, you return all of those lands that you've milled into your graveyard into the battlefield tapped. And then it has a mana sink of 3 and a green to put 4 +1/+1 counters on target land you control, and it becomes a creature with haste. So just an alternative win condition and kind of fun, right? I mean, like doing the meld strategies is always a good time, and it's just like a one of, so it's not heavily leaning into it. Next up on the list is an Esper Tempo by Zendikar, and it won second place in the Standard Challenge 32 on December 30th. And this one's a new archetype for me. It's kind of taking like where, so mono blue tempo got kind of destroyed by Cavern of Souls, removing the ability to counter things. And so Dimir was an interesting place because you could take the spot removal from black and kind of replace the counter spells and still do the Haughty Djinn strategy. So this is taking it one step further and adding white to do some interesting things. So we've got like Helping Hand, which returns target creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Recommission, which does a similar thing, returns target artifact or creature with mana value 3 or less from the graveyard to the battlefield. And if it enters the battlefield this way, you get an additional +1/+1 counter on it. And then Monastery Mentor. So both of these are really great ways of getting your Haughty Djinn into play after it's been removed. And then the Monastery Mentor, whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you create a 1/1 white monk creature token with prowess. So you're kind of like adding this for a go wide off of the various spells that you're playing. Halo Forager allows you to play back your instances and sorceries from the graveyard. Picklock Prankster mills 4 cards as the adventure side and helps you fill your graveyard so that you can do the shenanigans with Recommission and Helping Hand and Halo Forager. And Haughty Djinn is a star 4 flyer that has power equal to the number of instant and sorcery cards in your graveyard, which works nicely with the self-mill kind of thing that's going on here. And but then also makes your instants and sorcery spells cost 1 less to cast. So Then we've got the Consider, which helps you fill your graveyard. Is also just cast a nice cheap spell. Chart a Course, which is one that we got at Lost Caverns of Ixalan. If you've attacked, then you just straight up draw 2 cards for 2. We've got 1 copy of Make Disappear in here. Since the Cavern of Souls is kind of making the counterspell strategy worse. We've got Otherworldly Gaze, which is straight up just for filling the graveyard. Sleight of Hand helps you fill the graveyard while also digging to your threats that you want to draw. We've got some interaction with the Bitter Triumph and Cut Down. 1 copy of Duress in the main. Kind of interesting to see these one-ofs as of a spell. And then we've got March of Swirling Mist, which is a nice win condition. You can phase all of your opponent's stuff out in 1 turn so that they don't have any blockers for your gigantic Haughty Djinn. So we're ditching the Tolarian Terror kind of strategy and leaning more into the Monastery Mentor. And I just think there's an interesting approach, and excited to see if it takes off. And in the sideboard, we've got 2 more copies of Duress for against the Azorius Control, Disdainful Stroke for against the Sunfalls and Domain, Bitter Triumph for increased spot removal, Preacher of the Schism, which we've seen this one replacing like the Sewer King in Esper Midrange, and I think this one's an interesting one to include because it is a nice defensive card as a 2/4 Death Touch, and then you can use it as additional card draw and advantage against your opponent, as well as going wide. So part of the Monastery Mentor is there is a little bit of that going wide. Destroy Evil, which is a nice one to bring in against the Esper Midrange for their enchantments. Sunset Revelry, which we often see in Azorius Control, can be really nice against your opponent to stabilize. And we've got Ledger Shredder, which so if you go way back in time, there was a Ledger Shredder deck back during the days of Streets of New Capenna. And so you get a 1/3 flyer that whenever a player casts their second spell each turn, Ledger Shredder connives. So you discard, and if you discard a non-land card, it gets +1/+1. So this one's a nice alternative threat because you are able to double spell very easily with the cheap amount of spells in this deck. We've got Negate for against the board wipes and spells of our opponent. And then we've got Temporary Lockdown, which we've seen this one more and more in the Azorius Control lists. This is particularly good in Best of 1, where if your opponent's on a board flood strategy, then Temporary Lockdown is your answer, right? So in Best of 3, you don't see as many, but I think the most popular board flood strategy is probably the Azorius Flash Soldiers. So you'd be looking to bring in that against them. And speaking of Azorius Soldiers, number 1 for the Standard Challenge 64 on December 31st was taken down by RemF. And so if we look at back 3 weeks ago, in week 5, I covered the Azorius Soldiers. And so there's been a couple of changes, but nothing too dramatic. So we're dropping the 2 copies of Malcolm, Alluring Scoundrel, which is the flyer that loots and then eventually gets the choir counters on it and can play free cards. And dropping Werefox Bodyguard from 4 copies down to a single copy. And for these substitutions, we're bringing in 3 copies of Tishana's Tidebinder, and the more that people play with this, the more they're realizing just how good Tishana's Tidebinder is and how many applications that it has. So not only can you remove your problematic like the artifact vehicle, the schooner, and make it into like a worthless card. You can hit Adeline and make it into a 0/4. You can hit sagas. So as sagas resolve, you can block the triggered ability, and then the saga just disappears. So it's really good against mono red and like Kumano. So you got to get a little creative with like what you're going to block with this and like what it's really good against. But it's definitely proving to be a worthy inclusion as time goes on. And then the last 2 cards were to include Invasion of Gobakon, which I thought was kind of an interesting one. So it gives you hand disruption. When it enters the battlefield, you look at your opponent's hand, and then you exile a non-land card from it. For as long as that card remains exiled, its owner may play it, but it costs 2 more to cast. So this is really good for targeting a Sunfall in your opponent's hand and making it cost 7. And then kind of protect you, because that was the whole point of the Azorius Flash Soldiers in the first place, was being able to hold up Make Disappear to remove Domain's Sunfall on 5. So Invasion of Gobakhan just brings up a little bit more of that disruption, and then is kind of just doing the thing that it was doing before. You're running the Lunarch Veteran to stabilize against early aggro strategies, Zephyr Sentinel, and Resolute Reinforcements so that you can flash these things in. One of the fun loops, right, is to flood the board with a lot of little 1/1s off of Wedding Announcement and such, play out a Knight Errant of Eos, and then use Zephyr Sentinel to bring the Knight Errant of Eos back into your hand to play it again. So you can do these really cool convoke loops, and then because you're bringing in like Lunarch Veteran and Knight Errant of Eos, which aren't soldiers, Harbin still works as a win condition because you will eventually get up to 5 soldiers, and it gives +1/+1 to your whole board, not just soldiers, but you need the 5. So you're dropping it down to 2 because there's less of those synergies. And then as far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, we've got Surge of Salvation, which is a new one I haven't seen in a whole lot of sideboards. You and permanents you control gain hexproof until end of turn. Prevent all damage that black and or red sources would deal to creatures you control this turn. And I think this is really nice against the Rakdos midrange strategy. So we've seen some more Rakdos lists making it into the best of 3 tournaments. And Surge of Salvation protects you from the both Brotherhood's End and the Burn Down the House, which red wraths that deal damage to the board. We've got Get Lost, 2 copies of Get Lost for some targeted removal. Protect the Negotiators, which can be a nice alternative to make disappear. Takashi's Welcome, which can be brought in to outvalue your mid-range opponents. Wandering Emperor, which is really nice against the Wraths. Bringing in a Planeswalker that is left behind is good. It is also pretty decent interaction against like the early aggro strategies because of being able to remove something and gain 2 life. Destroy Evil, as I mentioned before, this is just good sideboard to bring in if your opponent is running enchantments that are worth destroying, as well as large creatures or threats like Shieldred. Lantern Flare, because of this is the one board flood strategy in best of 3. Lantern Flare works really well. It deals X damage to target creature or planeswalker, and you gain X life, where X is the number of creatures you control. You're not going to be playing black or the red, so you're not going to be cleaving it. And then we've got Lauren of the Third Path, which, like Destroy Evil, you're going to bring in against the enchantments in specific matchups. And then a 4th copy of Tishana's Tidebinder. If it's really working for you, you can bump the copy up to 4. All right, next up, number 2 was taken down by Esper Midrange by David 1987, which was number 2 in the Standard Challenge 64 on December 31st. And the list was exactly the same as the one that I covered last week. So if you want that one, go check that video out. So next up, we're going to cover Domain, which took down 3rd place by True Hero on the 30th, and then 3rd place on the 31st by Matthias SKM. And so if we compare this to the list that I covered last week, which I believe, if I remember correctly, was piloted by Mogged, we see a couple of new additions. The one that really stands out is Trumpeting Carnosaur. So running 4 copies of Trumpeting Carnosaur, which I really like. So you've got 2 in a red. You can discard it to deal 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker. So it kind of works like the Virtue of Persistence, the black removal. And but then it gives you kind of like an alternative late game threat. So you get a 7/6 Trampler for 6 that then discovers 5. And so you're not really going to be chaining it into your really big late game threats, but it's a way to find like an emergency Sunfall, although it will wipe itself. You can hit into an Invasion of Zendikar, a Topiary Stomper, trigger, chain some Up the Beanstalk synergies. So I'm really curious to see how the Trumpeting Carnosaur ends up playing. And so we've also upped the Invasion of Zendikar to 4 copies from 3. There's kind of like an ebb and flow of whether or not you're going to include how many copies of Invasion of Zendikar you're going to include, because it's kind of dependent on whether or not you have the play versus the draw. So when you're on the play, you can take the turn off more easily than when you're trying to try to catch up with your opponent's pressure on the draw. Right, so like if you're playing this on turn 3 after a Topiary Stomp, or I guess turn 4 after a Topiary Stomper, you're more punished for it when you're on the draw than when you are on the play. And similarly, like the more aggressive the meta is, the more you're likely going to bring this number down. So I've seen a lot of sideboard guides and such, right? That like if you're on game 2 and you know that you just won your game 1 in best of 3 and you need to like figure out what you're going to sideboard, the Invasion of Zendikar is a really good one to bring out because it does perform worse when you're on the draw. So hopefully that makes sense. But anyway, we're up to 4 copies there. Taking out the 1 copy of Wandering Emperor that was brought into the main, as well as the 1 copy of Nissa, Ascended Animist. So just no Planeswalkers in the main. Also, no copy of Depopulate or Vanquish the Horde. So decreasing the overall wraths. And because Trumpeting Carnosaur works to find your Sunfalls, you kind of have like 7 copies of Sunfall with this Discover. It's not perfect, right? Because you can hit these other cards, but if you've played these other cards, then you kind of can roll for it in a sense. So I thought that was kind of an interesting one to decrease the overall wraths, and also notably the Sunfall is down from 4 copies to 3. And then to reflect, bringing in the double pip red card, we've tweaked up the mountains from 1 to 2 and gone down 1 planes. And then the best of 3 sideboard, we've got Destroy Evil for against the Enchantment Hate, Negate against Azorius Control, Depopulate if you do need that Wrath, Obstinate Baloth, which is really nice against Liliana or cards that make you discard, you get a free card, and then it also helps you stabilize against like Mono Red, you can gain 4 life. Knockout Blow, which is really good for if you're up against the red deck, you can bring in the Knockout Blow because then it deals 4 damage to target attacking creature and you gain 2 life for 1. And then with Chromhost Seed Shark is a nice alternative win condition because of its synergies with Leyline Binding, creating a 6/6 incubator token. Jace, the Perfected Mind, is really nice in the mirror match because you can mill your opponent out. And then we've got 1 copy of Sunfall if you do want to kind of bring things in against the board-centric strategies. So if best of 3 and sideboarding is not your jam and you just want to know what the best thing to climb the ladder is, in my opinion, I think the one that I'd go with is the Mono White Humans list that I covered in week 6. It's the one that's running Brushlands, which is the green-white Painland, and Cavern of Souls, so that you can play the green side of Kellen, which is a new card that we got in Lost Caverns of Ixalan. Since I can't cover the same list every single week, I do like to kind of see what the new ones are, and you guys pointed out to me I haven't covered Azorius Control in ages, and this week it was number 3 for on Untapped, which is a site that tracks Magic the Gathering data, and so with over 1,000 matches played. So if we go all the way back to the week 4 of Wilds of Eldraine, we see some changes. So one of which was Wandering Emperor down to 2 copies from 4, and Depopulate down from 4 to 3. No copies of Make Disappear, no copies of Quick Study, Soul Partition, Urza's Rebuff, and Virtue of Knowledge, which was like a way to kind of trigger Jace. So the ultimate win condition of this deck is mill. You're just trying to answer all of your opponent's plays and then mill them out. So instead of doing the Virtue of Loyalty Virtue of Knowledge to copy Jace to double mill them, a lot of the lists have been leaning into the Teresian Mindbreaker, which as you go through your deck and eventually you can self-mill yourself and get the Unearthed card into exile to be able to trigger it for its cheaper cost. You can also discard it with the Fateful Mending, and either way, you kind of want to get this into your graveyard so that you can cast it for cheaper than 7. But when you attack with this, it also Unearth gives it haste, so it's not just sitting on your board. But yeah, so you unearth this, you attack for 6/4. It doesn't really matter what your damage doesn't matter in this deck. What's important is your defending player mills half of their library rounded up. So this is very similar to Jace is going to hit them for 15 some odd cards, and then you play the Jace and you finish them off. And then so what else is new? Oh yeah, so we moved into 4 copies of Sunset Revelry, which is just really great for what you're paying 1 and a white, and you get 2 1/1s, and you gain 4 life as long as you play it at the right time. So your opponent needs to have more life than you, and your opponent needs to have more creatures than you. And if they have more cards in their hand as well, then you also draw a card. That one happens a little bit less often, in my opinion, than just creating the 2/1/1s and gaining 4 life. But this is a really annoying card to play around, especially in best of 1 with the aggro decks, right? So this is like the way to survive. We've got two copies of Sunfall. The original list was just leaning heavily on Depopulate, and Sunfall is really nice for the exile specifically. Like in Azorius Soldiers, for example, if your creatures die, they respawn 1/1s. If they're exiled, they're just gone forever. And then on top of that, this could have just been exile all creatures, honestly, and still been pretty powerful. But the fact that it gives you an incubator token where X is the number of creatures that were exiled this way just puts it over the top, because you get you're not really trying to win through damage, you're trying to win through mill. So after you've wiped your entire opponent's board, you're left with an incubator token, which then is a threat that your opponent has to deal with, becomes a good blocker. And it's just this card's, everybody knows this card already, right? Like, it's just not cool. And then we've got Get Lost, which was a removal spell from Lost Caverns of Ixalan. This one, you don't care if they have the map tokens, you're just going to wipe everything anyway, because you've got 4 copies of Temporary Lockdown. So you can give them the map tokens and then play the Temporary Lockdown and take them away. And this is just... Temporary Lockdown is a really great strategy in best of 1 specifically, because of how just... it destroys mono white humans and the Azorius Soldiers, and there's so many strategies that are looking like a Celestine enchantment. So like, the earlier the curve is, this is just destroys all of that and resets everything. And then we've got Celestis, 2 copies of Celestis, which gives you some nice filtering, helps you find your additional wraths, and kind of does plays around with the day-night cycle, so you can prevent your opponent from playing 2 cards unless they're going to switch it to day and give you additional stuff. And then, like, if you're going to double spell, you can you can manipulate it and gain life and filter to your threats. And then yeah, so this one is one that I'm always a little hesitant to cover. I'm going to put it on the poll this week, so if you guys want me to play 50 matches of Azorius Control, I will. The one downside with this deck is that you usually can play 2 games of something else for every one that you're playing with Azorius Control. So it's very slow, it's very grindy, and but there is something satisfying about answering all of your opponent's plays and playing a very reactive strategy, and then getting the mill victory has a certain level of toxicity in and of itself. So yeah, we'll see if this one wins the vote this week. All right, next up in best of 1, I forgot to mention that number 2. I think I forgot to mention that number 2, the number 2 best deck, in my opinion, to climb the ladder is mono red aggro, which I covered in week 7. So if you don't want to do the mono white humans, if it's too many rare cards, it's not your jam, then I highly recommend checking out the mono red aggro list that was running the 1 copy of Shivan Devastator that I covered last week. So the next couple of lists here that I'm going to cover are a little bit more speculative. So number 4 and number 5 after the Azorius Control deck were the Celestine enchantment decks. Either the ones that were running the full set of rare lands, or the one that was substituting 4 brushlands for just plains and forests. Those were number 4 and number 5. And then so the speculative pick this week is going to be a mono white humans list. And so if we compare this to the one that I covered in week 6 of Lost Caverns of Ixalan, has the most similarities. Very few changes, actually. So we're going up 1 more copy of Hopeful Initiate, or 1 copy of Skrelv, and then we're ditching the 1 copy of Guardian of New Benalia for a Virtue of Loyalty. And I think the Virtue of Loyalty could be fun to play. When I've played mono white humans, I feel like creating a 2/2 at instant speed does have its moments where it catches your opponent off guard. And then the only anti-synergy really is Thalia, and because it will make this more expensive to play. But then the Virtue of Loyalty, giving everything +1/+1, can kind of give you this like late game strategy if you didn't quite get enough to get through. So curious to see how this one plays, and curious to see if it will overtake Kellen, the list that's running the Kellen and the Brushlands. I don't think it will, but you never know. All right, and speaking of lists that I haven't covered in a while, how about Esper Legends in best of 1? So I covered it in best of 3 last week, but I haven't really talked about Esper and what it's doing in best of 1. And there's definitely been a preference for just the pure aggro strategies. And so, like, the mid-range strategy of Esper Legends, I think is generally better in the best of three space, because what the deck does well is its adaptability. But if we kind of like tweak this so that it can perform best in the best of one meta, I do think you can climb the ladder with it. And I have all the cards for it, so I'm going to at least put it on the poll this week. And so we've ditched the 2 copies of Gix Yawgmoth Praetor. The card advantage off of Gix is generally better for against other mid-range strategies where you're going to try to outvalue them through card advantage. And bringing up one more copy of Lauren of the Third Path, just because of how popular Celestia Enchantments is on the best of one ladder. Ditching the 3 copies of the Preacher of the Schism, and leaning more heavily into Lord Skitter, Sewer King, which once again makes sense for best of one, because you're going to go for the go wide Rafine strategy, less so of the I'm going to outvalue with card advantage. 1 copy of Spell Pierce, because Azorius Control is a very popular list in the meta. 1 additional cut down from the best of 3 list, mono red, mono white, very popular. So I'm actually a little surprised to only see 2 copies of cut down here. 1 more copy of Go for the Throat, so just increasing the spot removal because the early interaction is more important in best of 1. And then we're ditching the Make Disappears. We're not going for the slow counterspell thing. I mean, we've got 1 copy down from 4. And then no Destroy Evils, because the likelihood of bumping into the Wedding Announcement and Virtue of Loyalty is just less likely in best of 1. And then we're tweaking the lands to kind of reflect the changes over here. We've got 2 copies less of a Darkheart Waste, going up 1 more copy of Rafine's Tower. The Restless Anchorages, we're bringing them up from 2 to 3 to give us some late game threats and answers against all of the Azorius Control. And then we've got 1 more copy of Shattered Sanctum, and no copies of the Shipwreck Marsh, and bringing in the legendary lands of Agonjo for some removal, and then Takanuma for basically looping back Shieldred. All right, and last but not least is there's an Azorius Soldiers list that caught my eye, and I liked what it was doing. So I'm really curious about how I just ran 50 matches of Azorius Soldiers in best of 1. But I am curious about how this deck does. Because one of the things that was kind of problematic with the previous list was the 4 copies of Mishra's Foundry. There was a couple of games where I was just like, man, I really wish I had less colored mana, because with the, like especially with Harbin and a lot of these like single pips, there's not a lot of room for the colorless mana in general. So ditching the 4 copies of Mishra's Foundry, and I like that. Ditching 1 copy of Skystrike Officer. So we've seen this fluctuate between like 2, 3, and 4. I've liked this card against mono red, where you can like create the 1/1 chump blockers that allow you to kind of block for free. That way, if they have the monstrous rage, they just trample over a 1/1 token instead of something that you actually care about. But after playing the Azorius Soldiers deck, I do think that like Skystrike Officer typically just ends up getting removed before, and like the real value of the drawing 3 cards feels like best of 1 is too fast to really outvalue most of your opponents. So dropping this one down from 4 to 3 is interesting. I want to see how it plays. And then the increasing my roll from 1 copy up to 3, and it's felt pretty good. It gets around. This is specifically really nice, kind of like Adeline on 3. My roll gives you that 4 toughness, which is really nice against mono red. And when I was playing the deck yesterday, my roll always felt good. Whenever I was playing it, disrupts your opponent's ability to play things on your turn. Prevents them from activating the incubator token if they don't do it while before the spell resolves. And then I felt like this was the most consistent way that I got to like a critical mass for Harbin was through my roll. So leaning more heavily into the Harbin and my roll synergies. Curious to see how this one plays out. And then we ditched the Addarkar, or dropped the Addarkar Wastes from 4 to 1, so ditching 3 copies there. which I like this as well. I think that the Pain Lands, the worst matchup is mono red, and the Pain Lands definitely don't help you in that situation. So in best of one, tweaking this to kind of be a little bit better against its worst performance. And since we're getting rid of the Mishra's Foundries, we can kind of relax a little bit on the lands in general. I thought bringing in Plaza of Heroes was interesting because you do really want to protect Myrel, and you do really want to protect Harbin. So being able to play Plaza of Heroes to keep these alive, I like that a lot. And then we've we're bringing in 2 copies of Deserted Beach, which we saw the fast lands, and there were times where like you do kind of want to hit 5 mana for Valiant Veteran or for like double spelling, and so sometimes those were kind of annoying to have. And leaning more into the Deserted Beaches, which come into play tapped unless you control 2 or more other lands. So these are the slow lands, and I'm curious to. I like that change too. I feel like that might give me better consistency in the mana, and then otherwise we're just bringing up the main the basic lands. We're bringing in 4 copies of plains and 3 copies of islands. I don't think the previous list was running any basic islands, which it works nicely. There's more Field of Ruin. There are more cards that are making you look through your deck for basics, and like I said, I think that I like what they're doing. Thumbs up here, right? So we're getting rid of the 4 copies of Seachrome Coast, the fast land in blue-white. So thank you as always for watching to the end of the video. Remember to place your vote here on YouTube for the next 50 match summary. And thanks for listening to my ramblings. And if you have anything you want, I'd love to hear your guys' feedback. If you find this helpful, I try to make it useful for people who have played a whole lot of Magic and people who are new to Magic. I hope it gives you a nice sense of what the meta is doing. If you have any suggestions, please let me know. I love to hear it. And take care, everybody. Have best of luck climbing the ladder in the new season, in the new year. And maybe I'll see you on the ladder.